She signed where the pin pointed and walked out into a gray October morning with $60 folded in her sock and nowhere to be by nightfall. The caseworker had a clock on the wall that ran 4 minutes fast. Wren had checked it against the bus schedule taped beside the door. Small habits like that had kept her hands busy through 6 placements, through 7 different bedrooms, that never quite became hers, through the particular arithmetic of a life that required you to know at all times exactly how much you had and exactly how long it would last. She had 2 bags. One held clothes, the other held a sleeping bag. 3 books and a canvas tool roll she had carried through every placement without once leaving it behind. The canvas was soft with handling dark at the edges, where oil had soaked in over years of use. It had belonged to a man named Hollis Baird, and it was the only thing she had left of him, and she did not think about that directly, because thinking about it directly was the kind of thing that stopped a person from moving, and she needed to keep moving. Hollis had been her 4th placement. She was 12 when the state brought her to his house, a low, clapboard place 3 streets back from the rail yard in a town called Dunmore, with a detached garage that smelled of linseed oil and sawdust, and the particular quiet of a man who did not feel the need to fill silence with himself. He refinished old furniture. He had a bad knee and thick forearms, and a habit of standing back from a piece of work with his arms crossed and his head tilted before he touched it, reading it the way other men read a newspaper. The first week he barely spoke to her. She had learned by then that waiting was safer than asking, so she waited. On a Saturday in November, he set a wrecked side table in front of her on the garage floor. The veneer was lifting. One leg had been cracked and poorly glued. Water rings bloomed across the top in dark, overlapping circles. "Folks were going to burn this," he said. "Threw it out on the curb. You know what's wrong with it?" Everything, she said. He almost smiled. She would remember that almost for the rest of her life. "Nothing's wrong with it that hands can't fix," he said. He handed her a scraper. "A thing isn't ruined just because it's been left. It's ruined when nobody's willing to do the work." For 2 years she did the work. She learned to read grain, to feel with her fingertips where the wood wanted to go and where it would resist. She learned to coax a stuck drawer loose without splitting it, to bring a dead finish back with steel wool, and patience and 3 coats of oil applied in the direction of the grain. Hollis gave her his second-best block plane, then his best one, and stopped calling it his. The garage was the first place she had ever walked into, and felt the room get easier when she arrived instead of harder. Then one morning he did not come out for breakfast, and the paramedic said it was his heart, and a different woman with a different folder moved Wren to a group home across the county before the funeral was even scheduled. Nobody asked if there was anything she wanted to take from the garage. She did not ask either, because she had learned that asking led to conversations that led to forms that led to nothing. But Hollis had left the tool roll on the kitchen table the night before, beside a note in his handwriting that said only her name and the word keep. So she kept it. Through every placement after that, the canvas roll went where she went, the steel cold and honest in her hands when nothing else made sense. That was 6 years ago. She was 18 now. She had $60 and nowhere to be by nightfall, in the tool roll under her arm, and she walked from the county offices to the public library because the library was warm and did not charge admission. She spent 3 days there reading job listings. She had no address to apply from watching the October light shift across the reading room floor. On the corkboard near the returns desk, between a flyer for a missing cat and a notice about a quilting circle, someone had tacked a single sheet printed on county letterhead. Public auction tax delinquent properties. Calder County Annex Thursday, 10 in the morning. A column of parcel numbers ran down the page in small type. She was not sure why she went. The annex was warm and free to sit in, and she had nowhere else to be at 10 on a Thursday. Maybe it was that, or maybe it was something older. Some instinct from years of watching other people's lives change hands while hers stayed fixed, that made her want to be in a room where things moved on the chance that one of them might move toward her, him. The annex smelled of wet wool and burnt coffee. Folding chairs had been set in rows. 20 or so people sat in them, most of them men, most of them with the easy boredom of regulars. A few held notebooks. Two wore good coats that said they had money and were there to make more of it. The auctioneer worked from a podium at the front, moving through lots in a flat, efficient voice. A flooded duplex, a vacant corner lot behind a gas station, a storefront that had failed as three different restaurants. Wren sat in the back row and watched hands go up and numbers move through the air like weather. She did not raise her hand. She was not there to buy anything. She was there because the room was warm and because watching other people make decisions was something she had always done more than she had ever done anything else. Then the auctioneer paused before the next lot, and the pause was the thing that made her look up from the floor. Parcel 41-9, he said. The house on Quarry Street. Some of you know it. A few people laughed low, the laugh of a room that had made this particular sound before. 2 stories plus a turret. Sits on a double lot. Back taxes going on 12 years. Condition listed as poor. Sold as is, whereas county takes no responsibility. Takes no responsibility is right, a man near the front said, and the room laughed again, easier this time. A woman 2 chairs over leaned to her neighbor and said it was the Vane place. Her boys wouldn't walk past it after dark. The neighbor nodded like this was information he had carried for some time without needing to examine it closely. The auctioneer let the room settle. Then he said, "We'll open at $15, and he said it the way you say something you expect to take back." Wren did the arithmetic before she decided to. 15 left her 45 and change. A double lot. 2 stories of walls and floors and a roof that had kept 12 years of weather off whatever was inside. A turret which meant corner structure, which meant the framing had been thought about by whoever built it. She thought about the shelter on 3rd Street, where you had to call by 4 and be out by 7 the following morning, and do it again the next day, and the day after that, indefinitely. And she thought about Hollis, and then she stopped thinking and raised her arm. It went up slow and steady, the same motion she used to lift a plane off the wood at the end of a stroke, so it would not tear the grain. "I've got 15. The auctioneer scanned the room. $15. "Do I hear 20? Nobody moved. One of the men in good coats turned all the way around in his chair to look at her. His expression was not pity. It was closer to the look a person gives someone who has reached for the last seat on a bus without being aware of the unspoken order of things. "Honey," the woman with the boys said, not unkindly, "you don't want that house." 15 going once, the auctioneer said. A man near the aisle said loud enough to carry "Let her have the ghost. She can charge admission, going twice." Wren kept her arm where it was and her eyes on the front of the room the way Hollis used to stand when a customer questioned his estimate. Calm, certain of the work in his own hands. The gavel came down. Sold. The house on Quarry Street to the young lady in the back for $15. He shook his head as he wrote it, a small private gesture that she filed away without comment. She paid at the clerk's window in 1s and a 5. The clerk, a young man with a careful tie and the look of someone who had learned early to keep his face neutral at work, slid a single sheet across the counter and then a key on a loop of knotted string, the brass dark with age and handling. He held the key a half-second longer than the transaction required. "You know about that property," he said. It was not quite a question. "I know it's mine now," Wren said. She folded the deed into her jacket and walked out before he could decide to warn her about anything. Quarry Street climbed the east side of Calder through blocks that got plainer and more tired the higher you went until the pavement gave out into broken concrete and the trees crowded close on both sides. At the top, where the street ran out against the hill, the house stood alone on a double lot behind a fence that had been surrendering to the weather for years. 2 kids on bikes had followed her the last half block, keeping their distance. When she turned up the walk, one of them braked hard. "You're not going in there," the boy said. "It's mine," Wren told him. "I live here now." The 2 of them exchanged the long look of children, deciding whether something is a joke. "Nobody lives there," the girl said with the patient certainty of someone correcting a simple error. "There's a lady. My brother saw her in the window. She's been dead a long time." "That's a cat," Wren said. Neither of them looked convinced. They pushed off down the hill, and one of them called something over his shoulder that the wind took before it reached her. She stopped at the gate and looked at the house, and for a moment she understood why the town told stories about it. It was a tall Victorian with a round turret at the northeast corner, 3 stories of it reaching into a gray sky. The paint had gone the color of old bone. Most of the windows were boarded, and the ones that weren't stared down at her blank and dark. The porch sagged badly on one side where a post had rotted through. A wild rose long past any tending had climbed the entire north wall and pulled a section of gutter loose from the fascia. Everybody who looked at this house saw a haunted house. Wren stood at the gate and made herself see it differently. She saw a roof that had held for 12 years of neglect. She saw a porch that had failed at the post, not the joinery. She saw a foundation course of good stone running straight and level along the front. She saw bones. A movement in the upper window made her flinch. She looked up in time to see a pale shape withdraw from the glass, low and quick, and her heart caught before she understood the shape of it. A cat, black large, watching her from behind the unboarded glass with the expression of someone who had been expecting company and was reserving judgment. The front steps held her weight barely. The key fought the lock for a moment, then gave, and the door swung inward on a long groan into a hallway full of gray light, and the smell of cold ash and dust, and something faint beneath it, dry and sweet, like old paper left in a warm room. She stood on the threshold of the first thing she had ever owned and listened to the house settle around her. "Hello," she said, and felt foolish saying it, and said it anyway. Nothing answered, but somewhere deeper in the house, soft on bare boards, she heard the cat moving. She went in. The hall opened into rooms that had gone to ruin in the patient way. Empty houses go plaster down in sheets. A chandelier webbed with years of dust. A staircase curving up into shadow with a banister. She could tell at a touch was solid oak under the grime. She moved through slowly the way Hollis had taught her to assess a piece before touching it, cataloging damage and worth at the same time, the habit so deep she did not notice she was doing it. The floors were wide plank and sound. The windows that were not boarded were old wavy glass, the kind that was no longer made, that bent the light in ways modern glass did not. Whoever had built this house had built it past them. It was the back hallway that stopped her. A row of iron hooks ran along the wall at waist height. Below them, a second row set lower at the height of a small child. Dozens of hooks, far more than one family could fill in a lifetime. She turned and saw the door frame into what must have been the dining room, and the paint there was scored from floor to ceiling with pencil marks. Short, horizontal lines, each one with a date and a name written beside it in different hands. The lowest were a few feet off the floor. The highest were above her head. She crouched and read the nearest ones. A name she could not quite make out, and a date. Another name, another year. Some of the marks had been drawn over the names faded, the earliest going back decades. Not a family's growth chart, something larger, something with more children than any one family had. The kitchen confirmed it. It was the size of a small restaurant's kitchen, with a cast iron range built for quantity and a long scarred work table and shelves that had held more plates than any household owned. Wren stood in the middle of it with her 2 bags still in her hands and felt the first real unease she had felt since the gate. Not because the house frightened her, but because it did not add up. And things that did not add up required attention. She was still standing there when the cat found her. It appeared in the doorway, the black Tom from the window, lean and ragged at one ear, regarding her with green eyes that held no fear and no particular warmth. It looked at her the way you would look at someone who had wandered into your house. Then it turned and walked back into the hall, stopped and looked over its shoulder. She had grown up around enough strays to know what that meant. She set down her bags and followed. It led her up the curving stairs, sure-footed in the places where the boards were soft, along the second-floor corridor, past 3 closed doors, and then it stopped at the very end of the hall and sat down in front of a stretch of wallpaper printed in a faded pattern of cabbage roses, and it would not move. "There's nothing there," Wren said. The cat did not so much as turn its head. It stared at the wall the way animals sometimes stare at things people cannot see, and under other circumstances that might have meant something different. But Wren had spent 2 years learning to read the things a surface was telling her, and after a moment she stopped looking at the cat and started looking at the wall, at how the hallway ran, at the room she had just passed, at the width of the house as she had seen it from the street. The hall ended too soon. She was certain of it. From the front gate, the second floor had appeared to run the full length of the house all the way to the corner turret. From inside, it stopped a good 15 feet short at a wall covered in cabbage roses with a cat sitting in front of it, like a clock that had been waiting years for someone to ask the right question. She pressed her palm flat against the paper. Behind it, faint and unmistakable, came the cool draft of a space the rest of the house did not know was there. The cat looked up at her and then back at the wall. Hollis's first rule had always been that you don't take a thing apart in the dark. The light through the boarded windows had gone the color of ash. She had one book of matches and no lamp. Whatever was behind the cabbage roses had waited longer than she had been alive. It could wait until she could see what she was doing. She went back down the stairs to make herself a place to sleep on the floor of the front parlor, and the cat stayed at the wall a while longer before it came down to find her. She slept in her clothes on the parlor floor, zipped into the sleeping bag with her jacket folded for a pillow, and the tool roll under her hand. The cold came up through the boards. The house talked all night, the small sounds old houses make when the temperature drops, ticks and sighs, and the long groan of settling timber. Twice she woke certain she had heard footsteps, and both times it was the cat on its rounds. Toward morning it came and lay against her spine, a warm weight she had not expected to be grateful for. "You stay, you eat," she told it, which was the only deal she had ever known how to offer. By the second day, she had started calling it soot for the color of it, and because it slept curled in the cold fireplace, like it had always belonged to the ash. Morning came up gray and useful through the gaps in the boards, and she walked the house with her hands. The plaster was a loss in most rooms, but plaster was only plaster. The bones were good. The big beams overhead were dry and true. The roof had one bad place over the back bedroom, where a coin of sky showed through where rain had been finding its way in for years, but it was one place and one place could be patched. She stood in the ruined kitchen and made a list in her head and started at the top of it, one problem at a time. Because that was the only honest way to face down an impossible job. Stop the water first, then a door that locked, then light, then warmth. Everything after that was finished work, and finished work she could do in her sleep. She went down the hill to spend some of what she had left. The town below had been built for more people than it held now, wide brick streets and tall storefronts, half of them dark. She passed a diner with fogged windows and kept walking until she found what she needed. A low building on the edge of the old industrial blocks, with a yard full of salvaged doors and clawfoot tubs and stacked lumber gone silver in the weather. A hand-lettered sign said Pruitt Salvage and Hardware Odd Lots. A bell announced her. Inside it smelled of old iron and cut pine, and a woman behind the counter looked up from a ledger. She was somewhere in her 60s, broad-shouldered with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and the forearms of someone who moved her own stock. "Help you find something," the woman said. "I need a hasp and a padlock," Wren said. "A tarp big enough for a roof patch lamp oil if you have it, and whatever roofing cement comes cheapest." The woman set down her pen. "That's a specific list for someone I've never seen. You working a job somewhere in my own place? I'm fixing it up." Whereat Wren had learned that the truth cost less than a lie in the long run. "The house on Quarry Street. I bought it at the county auction yesterday." The shop went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The woman looked at her over the tops of her reading glasses for a long moment. "You bought the Vane house," she said, "for $15. Wren said nothing. The woman let out a breath that was half a laugh and half something older. "Lord," she said, "somebody finally did." She came out from behind the counter and put out a square, calloused hand. "Lena Pruitt. I own this pile. Wren." Lena looked her over without apology, taking in the bag she had set by the door. The boots that had walked a long way, the tool roll under her arm. She did not ask any of the questions a worse person would have asked. "Come on," she said. "Let's get your roof closed." She loaded the cart herself, and Wren noticed the prices she wrote down were not the prices on the tags. A kerosene lantern she called a loaner. A coil of good rope she called scrap. When Wren began to object, Lena waved it off. "You're keeping the rain off the Vane house," she said. "Far as I'm concerned, that makes you a customer for life and you can owe me." They carried everything out to the salvage yard together, and Wren said because she had to ask somebody, "What's the story on it?" "Everybody acts like I bought a grave." Lena leaned against a stack of reclaimed doors and folded her arms. "Depends who you ask," she said. "Ask the county, it's a tax write-off they couldn't give away. Ask the kids in this town, it's haunted. There's a dead woman walks the turret at night with a lamp." She paused. "Ask me, I'll tell you the truth of it. Odessa Vane lived in that house close to 60 years, and she never turned a soul away from it. And this town decided that was the strangest thing it had ever heard of. I called it the only sane thing on the block." She looked out toward the hill. "I'd see a new face in town now and then, a young person staying up at the Vane place, and then a few months later, they'd be gone, and nobody ever asked where they came from or where they went. We were all too busy being scared of the woman to be curious about her." She shook her head slowly. "Odessa died 12 years back. Folks saw a light in that turret window her last years and convinced themselves it was a ghost before she was even in the ground. Easier than going up the hill." "What did she do up there?" Wren asked. "All those years." Lena was quiet a moment. "That she said is a longer story than your roof can wait for. You come back when you're dry, and I'll feed you and tell you some of it." She handed Wren the lantern. "Go on. Light's burning." Before Wren left, Lena disappeared into the back and returned with a paper sack that turned out to hold half a meatloaf sandwich and an apple. She set it in the cart without making anything of it. "Eat while you work," she said. "You're all elbows." Wren climbed the hill with more than she had come down with, and something tight in her throat that she did not have a name for and did not try to give one. She patched the roof that afternoon. It was cold, ugly work balanced on the steep slope with the tarp snapping in the wind and the cement stiffening on the trowel. But when she came back down, the gap of sky over the back bedroom was gone, and the house was for the first time in 12 years dry. She stood in the yard and looked up at what she had done and felt the specific clean satisfaction of a broken thing that was no longer broken. Soot watched from the sill. The next morning, she took the front door off its hinges. A decade of wet winters had swollen it in its frame until it dragged so badly it would not latch, which meant it would not lock, which meant she was sleeping in an open house. She laid the door across two sawhorses she made from porch timber, unrolled the canvas, and took out the block plane. It fit her hand the way it always had, as though the grip had been made for her specifically, which in a way it had since Hollis had adjusted the handle angle himself and then never adjusted it back. She set the iron fine and went to work on the swollen edge. The shavings came off in long, pale curls that smelled of a 100-year-old door, and the rhythm of the work emptied her head of everything except the wood, and she let it because this was the one place she had always known exactly who she was. She looked up after a while and found she had an audience. The same two children from the day before stood at the broken gate straddling their bikes, watching her work the plane with the focused attention of people observing something they had not seen before. "You really live here," the boy said. "I really do." She blew the shavings off the door and held one up. "Here. Smells like 100 years ago." The boy took it like it might be a trick, then sniffed it, and his face changed completely. The wariness replaced for a moment by the pure interest of someone encountering a new thing. They stayed 20 minutes asking questions. She answered straight, and when they finally pedaled off down the hill, they forgot to be afraid of the house at the top of it. It was a small thing. Small things were the only kind she had ever had to give. She did not notice the truck until the door of it closed. It was parked at her gate, a large clean pickup that had never hauled anything heavier than a set of golf clubs. The man coming up her walk wore a wool coat and boots that had never seen a job site, and he was looking at the house with the expression of someone running a calculation. He was in his early 60s, silver at the temples, with the easy posture of a man who had spent decades being the one in the room who did not need to raise his voice. That's a lot of work for one person, he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. Pleasant. I'm Royce Decker. You're the young woman who surprised us all yesterday. Wren. She did not stop planing. Did I take something of yours, she said. He smiled, and the smile was practiced and not entirely unkind. In a manner of speaking, my company's been working this block for 3 years. Senior housing, a medical clinic, some retail. Good for the town. This lot was the last piece. He spread his hands. I'll be honest with you, I expected to pick it up quietly. You beat me to it. No hard feelings. In fact, I came up here to make your week. He named the number. $8,000, he said. Cash today. And I'll cover the cost of moving you anywhere in the county you want to go. You paid 15 for a condemned fire trap. I'm offering you 8,000 and a clean start. That's not a negotiation. That's a gift. He let the number sit in the air between them. It was more money than Wren had ever seen collected in one place. For a moment, she let herself look at what it would open. A deposit somewhere. A real bed. Heat from a thermostat. The shape of an ordinary life. She set the plane down on the door. No, she said. Decker blinked. People did not say no to him often. She could see that in the small adjustment his face made, the way a man recalibrates when a door he expected to open does not. I don't think you understand the position you're in, he said, and his voice stayed warm, but the warmth had leveled out beneath the surface. That property has open code violations going back years. The county has wanted it condemned since before you were born. As the owner of record, that liability is now yours. I can make all of that disappear. He paused. Or I can let it run its natural course, and you can find out what it costs a person without money to fight a condemnation order. You came up here to be neighborly, Wren said, and now you're telling me you can have my house torn down. I'm telling you, he said carefully, that I'm the best offer this property will ever see from anyone ever. He took a card from his coat and set it on the porch rail. Think about it overnight. Don't think about it too long. He walked back down to his clean truck and drove away without looking back. And Wren stood with the plane in her hand and looked at the white card on the porch rail and did not pick it up. The notice was taped to her gate the next morning. County of Calder, it said across the top. Notice of unsafe structure. A hearing date had been set. 11 days out. The building inspector would recommend at that hearing whether the structure should be brought into compliance or scheduled for demolition. She read it twice. Then she folded it into her jacket beside the deed, because a person who owns nothing learns to keep all her papers in the same place. And she went back inside to work, because the work was the only answer she had ever found to anything. But the wall at the end of the hallway would not leave her alone, and neither would Soot. The cat had established a vigil. Every few hours it climbed to the second floor and took its position in front of the stretch of cabbage roses and sat there with the patient certainty of an animal that understood something the house had not yet explained. When Wren came up, it would look at her, then back at the wall, then back at her, and the meaning was plain enough that she had stopped pretending not to understand it. On the third afternoon, with 9 days left before the hearing, she gave in. She brought up the lantern and the flat pry bar and got down beside the cat and started reading the wall with her fingertips, the way Hollis had taught her to read a surface before she touched it with a tool. The paper was newer than everything else in the house. That was the first wrong thing. Everywhere else, the wallpaper had faded and curled and come away from the plaster in long strips. But this stretch was intact, tight to the wall, applied long after the rest of the house had been papered. Applied over something. She slid the putty knife under a seam and peeled, and the paper came away in a long strip, and what she found beneath it was not plaster. It was boards. Wide pine boards nailed flat in a rectangle taller than she was, and around their edges she could now see the casing of a door frame that someone had covered deliberately and carefully. Someone who had wanted the door not to be forgotten, but to disappear. She sat back on her heels. Soot sat beside her looking at the boards. Okay, she said, and her voice came out unsteady. You were right. She thought about Decker's card on the porch rail, washed soft now by a night of rain. She thought about the notice in her jacket and the $8,000 in the 11 days. She thought about the way he had said, "I can let it run its natural course," in the particular confidence of a man who already knew what course he intended. Then she fit the claw of the pry bar into the first board and set her weight against it and pulled. The board came loose with a shriek of old nails that rang down the empty hallway. The second came easier. By the time she pulled the fourth, she could see the door behind them, and the light outside the boarded windows had gone completely, and the only illumination left was the small warm circle of the lantern and the green coins of Soot's eyes in the dark beside her. The door had no lock, just a porcelain knob gone yellow with age, smooth and cold when she wrapped her hand around it. It turned. The door swung inward without resistance on hinges someone had oiled carefully before sealing. It swung inward into a darkness that smelled of dust and dry paper, and underneath both very faint of lavender. Wren lifted the lantern and held it through the doorway, and the light reached in and found the first thing, and she forgot how to breathe. The first thing the lantern found was a bed, a child's bed with a white iron frame made up neat with a quilt folded square at the foot, as if whoever had slept there had stepped out that morning and fully intended to be back before dark. The quilt was gray with the slow sifting of dust through a sealed room, but the corners were sharp, and someone had cared about the corners for a long time after they stopped mattering to anyone else. She stepped through the doorway and raised the lantern higher. The room opened around her. It was the missing end of the house, the 15 feet the hallway had not accounted for, wide and low, under the slope of the roof, with the round wall of the turret bulging out at the far corner, and a single tall window there. The window was painted over on the inside with black paint applied in careful overlapping strokes so that no light could show from the street below. Someone had not wanted it to be seen up here. Someone had come up here anyway, year after year in the dark with a lamp. The walls were shelving, floor to ceiling on both sides, and the shelves were full of boxes. Small boxes the size of a shoebox or smaller, each one labeled on the end in the same careful hand she had half recognized on the brass key tag. A first name and a year, another name, another year. The years went back and back. The earliest she could find, low in a corner where she had to crouch, said 1954. She set the lantern on the writing desk beneath the painted window and opened the nearest box. Inside was a child's life, or the piece of one that a careful person had thought worth keeping. A school photograph of a boy with a gap in his front teeth. A blue ribbon from a county fair. A letter folded many times in a child's printing. A single baby tooth wrapped in a twist of paper. A church program with one name circled in pencil. She did not understand it yet, but her hands had gone slow and careful, the careful of handling something that had cost somebody everything. On the desk sat a book. It was thick-bound in cracked black leather, the kind that stores called a ledger. It was the only thing in the room without a layer of settled dust, because whatever dust had found it had been wiped away more than once by a hand that had come back to this desk again and again over a long stretch of years. Wren sat down in the chair at the desk, the chair where someone had sat in the dark for decades, and she opened the book to the first page. At the top, in ink gone brown with age, in the same hand as the labels on the boxes, it said, "The children of this house." And beneath that a single line, every one of them was somebody's. We just kept them till somebody remembered. Then the entries began. They were short. A date, a name, sometimes only a first name, sometimes a first name, followed by a question mark where a last name should have been, and then a line or two. Came in November, half frozen, 14 years old. Said his daddy put him out. Stayed the winter. Sent him to my cousin in Ohio in the spring with a coat and $40. Then the next entry, then the next. Page after page, decade on decade, in the same hand getting shakier as the years climbed. The same woman's voice in ink for more than half a century. Girls who came frightened and left with a plan. Boys the county had run out of patience for. Children left at the door in the night with notes pinned to them that all said the only thing there was left to say. Please, just for a while. Wren read until the lantern guttered, and she trimmed it, and she kept reading. Some entries were 3 lines. Some were a single sentence that held a whole life inside it. A girl who arrived with a baby of her own and no ring and left 8 weeks later with a job at the cannery 2 towns over and someone to watch the baby while she worked. Twin boys whose mother had died and whose father had not been able to hold himself together, kept for 4 years, both of them in the army now, and both of them writing every Christmas. And one near the middle of the book where a girl's name had only this written beneath it. She never said a word the whole 8 months. She is safe now. 3 words for 8 months of a life. Wren read them twice and set the book down and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until the burning behind them stopped. She sat like that for a while in a sealed room in a house the town had been afraid of for 30 years, with a cat warm against her leg and a lantern burning on a dead woman's desk. The house had not been haunted. The house had been a place for 60 years run by one woman working alone and in secret because she had understood that doing it openly would mean being stopped. Odessa Vane had spent her life taking in the children that the system had finished with the ones who aged out or ran out or fell through the gaps, and she had kept them and fed them and sent them on their way and kept a record of everyone because someone ought to keep a record. And when she had gotten too old to take in anyone else, she had not built a monument to herself. She had gathered every trace of every child she had ever sheltered, every keepsake they had left behind, every note she had written about where they had gone, and she had sealed it all into a room and painted the window black so no one would come looking before the time was right. And then she had died, and the house had waited. Wren turned the last written page and found something tucked into the back cover. A single sheet folded once in the same hand as the ledger, but older, shakier, the hand of someone near the end of a long and deliberate life. If you're reading this, the house found you. It does that. Don't ask me how. I stopped asking years ago. There's no money to speak of. So if that's what you came up here for, I'm sorry. What's here is better than money and harder to keep. Keep the door open. That's all. Whatever else you do with this place, whatever else life asks of you before you're done with it, keep the door open. Wren sat in the sealed room with the page in her hands and soot warm against her leg, and for the first time since she was 12 years old, since a Saturday in November, an erect side table on a garage floor, and a man who had almost smiled, she felt like she had walked into a room and had the room get easier instead of harder. She had paid $15 for a house the whole town said was cursed. She understood now that she had paid $15 for something else entirely, and that it had a weight to it, and that the weight had just become hers. Before she sat down at the desk a second time to read the ledger from the beginning, she did one other thing. She found a rag in the bottom of her tool roll and worked it in slow circles across the inside of the turret window, wiping the black paint away in long strokes, the paint coming off in gray flakes onto the cloth. She worked until the glass was clear or nearly clear, until the town below showed through it in its small scattered lights, distant and ordinary and entirely unaware of what had just been found above it. It was the first time in 12 years that any light from this room could reach the street below. She did not know yet that someone would see it. She only knew it felt wrong to keep the window covered any longer. She went back to the desk and began to read again, and this time she read it as if every name in it was someone she was going to have to account for, because in some way she was beginning to understand that she was. She went down the hill the next morning before the light had fully settled. Lena was in the salvage yard moving a stack of reclaimed window frames when Wren came through the gate, and she looked up and read something in the way Wren was walking the particular set of a person carrying information they have not yet decided what to do with. "Come inside," Lena said. "I'll put coffee on." The back room of the salvage yard was small and warm, with a wood stove that had clearly been burning since before dawn, and 2 mismatched chairs pulled up close to it. Lena poured from a pot that had been sitting long enough to be serious, handed a mug across, and sat down without asking what had brought Wren down the hill at this hour on a morning that cold. Wren told her about the room. Not all of it yet, not the part she was still turning over in her own hands, but the rest of it. The door behind the wallpaper, the shelves of boxes, the ledger, the entry about the boy sent to Ohio with a coat and $40, The girl who had not spoken for 8 months. She told it plain the way Hollis had taught her to describe a piece of damage without drama, because the thing itself was dramatic enough. Lena listened with her hands wrapped around her mug and her eyes going somewhere Wren could not follow. When Wren finished, Lena was quiet for a while. 60 years, she said finally. Her voice had something rough in it. Lord, I knew some of it. The way you know a thing you've all agreed not to look at straight. You'd see a new young person in town staying up at the Vane place, and then after a while they'd be gone, and nobody asked. She paused. There was a boy in my class one year. Just the one year. And then he wasn't. And I never thought to wonder where a person goes when they leave a place like that. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, a quick, unsentimental gesture. We told ghost stories about that woman, she said. We let our children dare each other to touch her fence. And the whole time she was doing the only real work of loving in this town. She set her mug down on the stovetop. Why didn't she just tell people, Wren asked. Because in 1960, the county would have shut her down for running an unlicensed home, Lena said. And in 1980, they'd have done the same thing, and she knew it. A ghost can keep working. A do-gooder gets a visit from the inspector. The word landed between them like something set down carefully. The inspector, Wren said. Lena's face changed. You've got a hearing, she said. 11 days. Wren set her own mug down. Royce Decker came up the hill the day after I bought it. $8,000 cash. When I said no, the notice was on my gate the next morning. Lena was quiet for a moment that had a particular quality to it, the quality of a person connecting things they should have connected sooner. Royce Decker has been trying to get that lot for 3 years, she said. He's been putting the east side of this town back together block by block. Senior housing, a clinic, retail. The Vane property was the last piece he needed to make the whole thing work. She leaned forward slightly. He couldn't buy it while the back taxes were tangled up in county proceedings. So he waited, and when nothing moved fast enough, he stopped waiting and started pushing. Wren looked at her. The auction, Lena said. He expected that property to sit on that list until the county took it through a different process entirely, one that would have put it directly into negotiation rather than open bidding. You walking in and paying $15 was not part of his plan. Wren thought about the man at the auction who had not raised his hand because he had not needed to. She thought about the way he had turned in his chair to look at her, not with pity, but with something closer to irritation. He's not going to stop at the notice, Wren said. No, Lena said. He's not. She picked up her mug again and looked into it for a moment. You let me think on this, she said. I've lived in this town 60 years and I'm owed a few conversations I've never asked for. She reached across and gripped Wren's wrist, brief and firm. You're not the only one ashamed of how we treated that woman. There's more of us than you'd think. We just need a reason to stop being quiet about it. Wren went back up the hill and worked. She worked because it was the only answer she had ever found, and because she had 10 days left, and because the alternative to working was sitting in a cold house thinking about a man in a wool coat who had spent 3 years arranging for this outcome and had the patience and the resources to arrange it again in whatever new form was necessary. She pulled out the list of violations from the notice. 23 items typed in the flat bureaucratic language of a county that did not particularly care whether the language landed. Failing porch structure, compromised roof section, ungrounded electrical, no certificate of occupancy, plumbing not to current code. She read through each one the way she had learned to read through a damage assessment on a piece of furniture, looking for what was cosmetic and what was structural, what could be addressed with skill and what required materials she did not have money for. The roof she had already patched. She had photographs in her head of where the tarp ended and the original surface began, and she knew the patch would hold through an inspection if the inspector was honest about what constituted a repair. The porch was the post. One post had failed, and because that post had failed, the roof line above it had dropped 2 inches, and the boards had separated from the ledger. She could sister a new post alongside the rotted one, transfer the load, and reattach the roofline boards if she had the right timber. She went through what Lena had put in the cart and found she did not have the right timber. She made a list of what she needed and what it would cost, and looked at what she had, which was $38 and some change, and she made different decisions about the list. She spent her third afternoon splitting what remained of a fallen oak from the backyard into rough posts. It was not finished work. It would not pass a close inspection by someone looking to fail it, but it would hold the roof and close the gap and pass an inspection by someone looking to see whether a property was being actively worked on rather than abandoned. She hoped the inspector was that kind of inspector. She did not know yet whether to bet on it. Each evening, before the light failed, she took photographs with the disposable camera she had found in the bottom of a box at Pruitt Salvage, marked down to $1.50, and she documented every repair she completed. The camera had 24 exposures. She used them carefully. On the sixth night, she was in the turret room reading when she heard a car laboring up Quarry Street. She went to the window, headlights below moving slow. Not Decker's truck. An older sedan, dark-colored, that stopped at the broken gate and sat there with the engine running for a long moment before the engine cut. A woman got out, silver-haired, moving carefully, leaning on a cane. She stood at the gate and looked up at the light in the turret window and put one hand over her mouth. Wren went downstairs and out onto the porch. "Can I help you?" she called. The woman looked up. Her face in the cold air was composed, but her eyes were not. "That light," she said. Her voice had a tremor in it that was not entirely age. "That light hasn't been on in years. I drove past tonight from my sister's and I saw it and I had to come up." She steadied herself on the gatepost. "I'm sorry. I had to." Wren came down the broken walk and helped her through the gate and up the porch steps and brought her inside and put her in the one chair that remained in the front parlor. And the woman sat down and looked around the ruined hallway with tears running along the lines of her face and a complicated kind of wonder underneath them. "It was so warm in here," the woman said. "You wouldn't think it to look at it now. There were always kids. There was always something cooking. She made you do your schoolwork at that big table, and she didn't ask you a single thing about where you came from unless you wanted to say." She looked at Wren. "How long have you been here?" "I bought it 5 days ago," Wren said. $15 at the county auction." The woman stared at her. Then she laughed a wet, startled sound. "Of course," she said. "Of course. That's exactly how it goes. She always said the house would find the next one." She reached up and caught Wren's hand in both of hers, and her grip was stronger than it looked. "You're one of us. You just got here the long way around." Her name was Dorothea Holt. She had come to the Vane house in the winter of 1966 at the age of 16 with nowhere to go. In a situation she did not name directly, even now. And Odessa had taken her in and kept her until spring, and then helped her find a way forward that had eventually led to nursing school and a career and a life that Dorothea clearly considered more than she had had any right to expect. She had driven past this hill for 50 years. She had never come up. Wren took her upstairs to the turret room. Dorothea stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves of boxes for a long time before she moved. And then she moved slowly, reading the labels with her fingers until she found the one that said her name. Inside was a school photograph of a thin girl with watchful eyes, a hair ribbon, a report card with every grade circled in red ink, and beneath those a folded note in Odessa's hand. "Stayed 2 years. Scared of everything when she came. Scared of nothing when she left. Went to nursing school. The proudest I ever was." Dorothea held the note with both hands and did not speak for a while. When she did, her voice was very even, the voice of a woman who had made peace with many things and had not expected to have to make peace with this one tonight. "She kept it," Dorothea said. "All this time, she kept all of it." After Dorothea left, Wren went back to the ledger and kept reading, and something had shifted in the quality of what she was doing. She was not reading anymore the way you read to understand a thing. She was reading the way you read when you understand that the names belong to people. People who were out there somewhere, scattered across the decades in the country, who did not know this room existed and did not know their name was on a shelf in a box with something of theirs inside it. She started a list on the back of an envelope. Names and last known places pulled from the entries, as many as she could find. She did not know yet what she meant to do with it. She only knew it felt wrong to leave them lost a second time. She was 3 pages into the list when she heard from Lena. Lena arrived the next morning with a folder under her arm and a look on her face that meant she had been on the phone since before dawn. She sat down at the kitchen work table and opened the folder. "I made some calls," she said. "I went through the county records on the Decker development project." She laid a page on the table between them. "He's had a variance application pending on this block for 2.5 years. The application requires contiguous ownership of all parcels. Your parcel is the only one he doesn't have." Wren looked at the page. "There's more," Lena said. 3 years ago, before the variance application, he filed a petition with the county requesting accelerated tax foreclosure proceedings on this property on the grounds of extended delinquency and public safety risk." She tapped the page. The county agreed to expedite. That process was moving toward completion when you walked into the auction room and paid $15. "So the auction was supposed to be a formality," Wren said. "The auction was supposed to produce no bids," Lena said. "At which point the property would have reverted to county ownership through a separate administrative process that does not involve public auction. And then it would have been available for direct negotiation, which is where Royce Decker's money and Royce Decker's relationships with county administration would have become relevant." Wren sat with that for a moment. She thought about the auctioneer's face when her hand went up, the small, complicated expression he had not quite managed to suppress. "He's not used to things not going the way he set them up," she said. "No," Lena said. "And when they don't, he adjusts. He doesn't stop. He adjusts." She paused. "He came to see me yesterday," she said. Her voice was neutral, but her jaw was not. "He came by the yard on some pretext about salvage materials for one of his sites. And at the end of it, he mentioned casually that the county business licensing office had been doing a review of commercial properties in this district, and that it was always a good time to make sure everything was in order." Wren looked at her. "He was telling me to stay out of it," Lena said. "He was doing it the way he does everything, politely, with plausible deniability and a smile." She closed the folder. "I've been in this town 60 years. I own my building and my stock outright. My license is in order. He cannot touch me. But I want you to know he tried." There was a silence between them, the particular silence of two people who have just confirmed something they had already suspected. "What do I do?" Wren said. "You keep working," Lena said, "and you let me make more calls." She did keep working. She worked with a focus that had changed quality from the days before Tighter Now directed. The 23 violations had become a list of arguments, and she was building the case for each one with her hands. She sistered the porch post and resecured the roofline boards. She replaced the latch on the back door with the hasp and padlock from Lena's. She cleaned the kitchen range and tested the flue and found it clear, which meant the stove could be used, which meant the heating violation was addressable without electrical work she did not have money for. Each repair she photographed. Each photograph she dated in pencil on the back. She also, in the hours between repairs, kept reading the ledger. She had developed a rhythm for it, reading forward through the decades in the evenings, by lantern light, with soot against her leg, the entries becoming more familiar. The more time she spent with them, the voice in the ink less like a stranger's and more like someone she was getting to know from the inside out. A practical woman, unsentimental in her language, which made the moments of sentiment when they came land harder. Brief, precise. Keeping track of things the world had decided were not worth keeping track of. On the 9th day, 5 days before the hearing, she found the entry that stopped her. It was longer than most. It began in the winter of 1963. A girl named Adela, 17 years old, had come to the door in January, 8 months along, sent quietly by a pastor 2 counties over who had known where to send the ones who had nowhere else to go. She had stayed through the winter and into the spring. She had the baby in the back bedroom with the help of a doctor who had been making that drive for years and had never once sent a bill. Her people had come for her in May when it was over. She had gone back to them and eventually married and never spoke of the year in between. Wren read the last 2 lines of the entry and then read them again. Her boy grew up right here in this town, and never knew where his first breath was drawn. He builds things now. Half the east side has his name on it. She sat very still. She thought about a man in a good wool coat standing at the bottom of her porch steps with a practiced smile and a number ready in his mouth. She thought about the name on the notice taped to her gate. She thought about Lena saying he's been putting the east side of this town back together block by block. She turned back to the entry and read it from the beginning slowly this time. Adela, January 1963. A baby boy born in the back bedroom in May. And at the bottom in ink that was newer than the rest of the entry, written in a hand, shakier than the one that had opened the ledger, Odessa had added a single line years after the original entry. He doesn't know. His mother carried it to her grave. But it's written here in case the day ever comes that somebody needs to give it back to him. Wren set the ledger down on the desk and looked at the cleared window at the town spread below in its small, ordinary lights. Royce Decker had been born in the back bedroom of the house he was trying to tear down. The man who had come up her hill with $8,000 and a condemnation notice, who had spent 3 years engineering the conditions for this property to disappear, who had stood at her porch rail with the patience of someone who had never lost a negotiation he had properly prepared for, had drawn his first breath in the room down the hall where she kept her sleeping bag. He did not know. His mother had carried it to her grave, and the only proof of it left in the world was sitting in Wren's 2 hands. She held the ledger for a long time. Soot pressed against her knee and did not move. The thing she was holding was a weapon. She understood that without anyone having to tell her. A man who had built his professional life on a version of himself that had nothing to do with an unmarked year in a frightened girl's past, who had a reputation and a company and a relationship with county administration that depended in part on the story he told about where he came from, that man could be stopped cold by what she was holding. Not threatened with it, just shown it. Just given it to understand that she knew and that other people might come to know. She could walk into the county hearing with this page, and it would be over in 60 seconds. She thought about that for the rest of the night and into the next day. She thought about it while she was working the plane along a stuck window sash on the 2nd floor, the shavings curling up and falling to the floor, the wood underneath pale and honest. She thought about it the way you think about something you are not quite ready to decide, turning it over and setting it down and picking it back up, checking it from different angles, the way you check a joint before you commit to the glue. She had been the thing someone else used for leverage before. Not in the same way, but the shape of it was familiar. The feeling of being a variable in someone else's calculation, of having your situation made the instrument of their outcome. She had spent 18 years being managed by people who held some resource she needed and were willing to deploy it to get the behavior they wanted from her. She did not want to do that to another person, even this one. But she also thought about Lena's face when she described Decker coming to the salvage yard. She thought about the turret room and the 60 years of careful record-keeping by a woman who had worked alone in the dark. She thought about what would happen to all of it if a wrecking crew came up Quarry Street and the house came down and the room came down and the boxes came down and every name in that ledger was gone. She did not decide. Not yet. She folded the entry page carefully and put it in her jacket beside the deed and the hearing notice, and she went back to work. 2 days before the hearing, Lena came up the hill with a different look on her face than Wren had seen before. Less the look of someone who had been on the phone, and more the look of someone for whom the phone calls had produced results they had not fully anticipated. "People have been talking," Lena said. She sat down at the kitchen work table and folded her hands. "I called some names from what you told me about the ledger, the ones I recognized, the ones I could find through people I know. And the thing is, Wren, they've been talking to each other. For years, some of them. In small ways, privately, without ever quite saying the thing directly. A man I went to school with had a brother who spent a winter here in 1972. A woman at the Lutheran church had a mother who came through in 1944. The retired teacher at the middle school, she's been quietly sending kids up this hill since before you were born, the ones with nowhere to go because she knew the door was open." She paused. "There are more of them than I knew," she said, "and they've all been carrying their piece of it alone. half ashamed and half grateful, and all of them waiting for someone to open the room. Wren thought about the entry she had been carrying in her jacket for 2 days. Who knows about the ledger, she said. A handful, the ones I called. I haven't told them everything, just enough to let them know the room is real and the records are real. She looked at Wren steadily. I think some of them want to come up. People started arriving that evening. They came in ones and twos, people Wren had never met. People who stopped at the broken gate the same way she had stopped at it, looking up at the house with an expression that had something old in it, something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed to show on a person's face. She brought them inside. She lit the lantern in the turret room and let them find their own names on the boxes. And she stood back and watched what happened when grown people discovered that a dead woman had kept a piece of their life in a shoebox on a shelf for 50 years. A man in his 60s, retired, who had spent a year here in 1971 and told no one held his box for a long time before he opened it. When he finally did, he found a photograph of himself at 11 and a report card and a folded note, and he read the note and could not speak, and then he said, I named my daughter after her. Never told the girl why. Figured the story made me sound like I came from nothing. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. I came from this. That's not nothing. A woman in her 70s found a photograph of herself at 9 in a dress Odessa had sewn, gap-toothed and narrow-shouldered. My grandchildren think this house is where you go on a dare, she said. I'm bringing them up here. They're going to know whose house it was. By the second evening, there was a casserole on the kitchen counter that Wren had not bought, and a box of work gloves by the door, and a folded check tucked under the lantern with no name on it. The house was waking up in a way that had nothing to do with renovation. Something older and more specific than that, the reactivation of a purpose that had always been there, waiting under the ruin, the way the good wood waited under the damaged finish, patient and intact. The night before the hearing, Wren could not make her hands hold still. She had faced down plenty of things in her life. Caseworkers, transfer notices, the particular cold of group homes in November when the heat was uncertain. But she had never stood up in a room full of adults and asked them for anything in a voice loud enough to be heard, because asking and being told no was the wound she had spent the longest time learning to stop reopening. Lena found her on the porch steps at dusk and sat down beside her without being asked. You don't have to be eloquent, Lena said. You just have to tell the truth and let them see your face while you do it. That's harder than being eloquent, but it's the only thing that's ever worked in a room like that. What if they vote to tear it down anyway, Wren said. Then they do it in front of every person who stood up for it, Lena said. And this town has to live with their own faces afterward. She put her hand briefly on Wren's shoulder. Either way, you make them look. The pipes froze that night. Not the old pipes which had frozen and thawed and frozen again for 12 winters without anyone to care. The new sections she had run to address the plumbing violations on the list, the copper she had sweated with fittings from Lena's, and a borrowed torch. The cold had come down hard after dark, harder than the forecast had suggested, and sometime around 3 in the morning one of the new joints let go, and the water that had been building pressure all evening found the path it had been looking for, and Wren woke to the sound of it running somewhere below her. She found it in the cellar. 2 inches of water on the stone floor, cold enough to make her breath visible. The broken joint overhead still dripping steadily. She stood in it in her boots and looked at the mess she had made of something that had been working, and felt the particular despair of a repair that has failed, which is different from the despair of a thing that was never repaired at all, because it carries in it the additional weight of having tried and come up short. She sat down on the cellar steps. It was 5:30 in the morning. The hearing was in 4.5 hours, and the plumbing violation she had spent 3 days addressing was now actively worse than when she had started. She sat there in the dark, in the cold water, and let herself for about 2 minutes feel exactly as alone as the situation warranted. Then the front door opened above her. She heard boots on the kitchen floor, and then Lena's voice calling her name down the cellar stairs, and then a second voice behind it, a man's voice, and then the sound of more than 2 people in the kitchen. Somebody had seen her lights on at 3 in the morning and called somebody else. By 6 o'clock, there were 5 people in her cellar with a shop heater and a torch and a length of new copper pipe, and the joint was sweated and wrapped and holding before the light had fully come up outside. One of the women had brought soup in a thermos. The retired railroad man had brought 2 wrenches and a way of working in a low space that spoke of 30 years of doing it. This is the part the ghost stories never told, Lena said, pushing the thermos into Wren's hands. Takes a whole town to haunt a house. Takes a whole town to unhaunt one, too. Wren drank the soup and thought about Odessa in the dark with the window painted black. Doing everything alone so that the thing could keep existing. Never letting anyone see the light because the light would bring attention, and attention would bring the county, and the county would bring the end of it. She had worked alone because that was the only way she knew to protect what she was doing. And it had worked for 60 years, it had worked. And it had also cost her 60 years of carrying the whole weight of it by herself, with no one to call at 3 in the morning when something broke. Wren did not have to do that. She was beginning to understand that this was the real difference between them. Not age, not ability, not even circumstance. Odessa had kept the door open in secret in the dark alone. Wren got to do it with people who came when the pipes froze, who showed up at 5:30 in the morning with copper fittings and soup, and did not ask to be thanked for it. That changed what the work weighed. It did not make it lighter exactly, but it changed the distribution of it, and that changed everything about how far a person could carry it. She went upstairs to put on her cleanest clothes. She still had the page in her jacket. She had not decided what to do with it, and she was going to have to decide in the next 4 hours, and she was trying not to let the undecidedness of it take up space she needed for what was coming. She thought about Odessa's note at the back of the ledger, written in case the day ever comes that somebody needs to give it back to him. Not use it, not leverage it, give it back. Wren stood at the turret window in her jacket with the deed and the notice and the folded page all in the inside pocket, and looked down at the town below the hill with its ordinary morning-lit windows and its long habit of not looking up, and she thought about what it meant to be the person who held a thing that belonged to someone else. She had been held before, not the same way, but she knew the feeling of being held, of having some piece of yourself in the possession of a system or a person who could deploy it for their own purposes, or simply file it away and forget it existed. She knew what it felt like to finally get that piece back. She took the page out and looked at it one more time. Adela, January 1963. A baby boy in May. It's written here in case the day ever comes that somebody needs to give it back to him. She folded it along its original crease and put it back. Then she went downstairs to the hearing. The county annex had bad carpet and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they had not slept, which in Wren's case was accurate. She arrived 20 minutes early in her cleanest clothes, which were not clean enough, and took a seat in the front row with the ledger and the canvas bag on her lap, and the stack of photographs in the front pocket of her jacket. The room filled slowly. She had not expected anyone she recognized, but they came anyway, ones and twos filing in through the side door and taking seats without announcing themselves. The retired railroad man, the woman in her 70s who had found her photograph, 2 people she had not met before who had the look of people who had driven some distance to be here for something they could not quite explain to anyone who asked. Dorothea Holt came in last, moving carefully with her cane, and took a seat at the end of the second row. She caught Wren's eye and gave a small nod that meant something Wren did not have a word for yet. Royce Decker arrived with the building inspector and a man in a suit that said attorney, without the attorney having to say anything. They took their places at the front table with the ease of people who had sat at front tables before and expected to sit at them again. Decker gave Wren a glance as he settled into his chair, brief and not unkind, the glance of a man who had already written the outcome and was here as a courtesy to the process. The chairman of the County Building Commission called the room to order. The inspector read the violations first. He read them in the same flat voice they had been written in, working down the list of 23 items without inflection or editorial comment. Failing porch structure, compromised roof section, electrical systems not to current code, plumbing not to current standard, no certificate of occupancy on record. The room listened with the patience of people who had sat through procedural readings before. Then Decker stood. He was good at this. Wren had known that from the first day on her porch steps, but watching him in a room of this kind made it clearer. He did not use the language of winning. He used the language of reluctant reasonableness, the language of a man who had examined the situation from every angle and arrived against his personal preferences at the only sensible conclusion. Nobody is the villain here, he said, and he said it the way you say something you want to preempt rather than something you believe. That property is genuinely unsafe. A young woman bought it sight unseen for $15, and she cannot possibly bring it to code on her own resources. I'm not here to take anything from her. My company is prepared to cover the full cost of demolition, settle the outstanding back taxes, and pay the current owner a fair market price on top of that. So she walks away with money in her pocket rather than a liability she will spend years unable to address. He spread his hands. That's not cruelty, he said. That's the most merciful outcome available to everyone in this room. Several heads nodded. It sounded like the truth. It sounded like the only sensible end to a story that had started with a foolish decision and a $15 bid. The chairman looked down at Wren. Ms. Calloway, he said, you're the owner of record. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we move to a vote? Her legs were not entirely steady when she stood, but they held. I do, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, and she made it larger. Mr. Decker says I can't bring the property to code on my own. He's right that I can't do it alone, and he's right that I don't have money. But there's something he doesn't know about that house, and something none of you know either. I didn't know it myself until last week. She reached into the canvas bag and took out the ledger and set it on the rail in front of her. This was sealed in a room nobody knew existed, she said, behind a papered-over door at the end of the second-floor hallway. It's a record. 60 years of it. She opened it to the first page. I'm going to read you some of it. She read the opening line. The children of this house, every one of them was somebody's. Then she turned to the entries and read, choosing them carefully, reading in the plain voice of someone presenting evidence rather than making an argument. The boy who came in November half frozen at 14, sent to Ohio in the spring with a coat and $40. The twins whose mother had died and whose father had stopped being able to hold himself together, kept for 4 years. Both of them in the Army now and writing every Christmas. She turned more pages. A girl who had come pregnant and frightened, sent quietly by a pastor who knew where to send the ones with nowhere to go, who left with a job at the cannery 2 towns over, and someone to watch the baby while she worked. She did not perform any of it. She read it the way you read something that does not require embellishment, because the facts are sufficient, and the bad carpet room got very quiet. Odessa Vane took in this town's children for 60 years, Wren said when she closed the book. The ones the county had run out of options for. The ones who aged out of the system with nothing the way I did 3 weeks ago. She never asked for credit. She never received any. You told ghost stories about her so you wouldn't have to call her what she actually was. She looked around the room. You can vote to tear that house down, but you ought to know what you're tearing down before you do. For a moment, nobody moved. Then in the second row, Dorothea Holt stood up. She did it slowly with the cane, and she did not look at the front table when she spoke. She looked at the room. I lived in that house in the winter of 1966, she said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had been a nurse for 40 years and knew how to make herself heard without raising it. I would be dead or worse if she hadn't taken me in. I went to nursing school. I worked at a hospital for 37 years. 3 of the people in this room were born in that hospital. She let that sit for a moment. I'm not a ghost story. I'm right here. She sat back down. In the third row, the retired railroad man got to his feet. 1971, he said. She fed me for a year and asked nothing. He did not try to say more than that, and he did not need to. He sat down. A woman by the window stood. My mother was one of hers during the war. She paused. I'm standing here because that house stood there. A man near the door rose and said a single year and could not manage anything beyond it, But the year was enough, and it landed in the room with the weight of everything it stood for. Then another, then another. One after another, all through the room, people stood and said a year, and the years ran back more than half a century, and the fluorescent light fell across a room full of faces that were doing something Wren had not seen a room of faces do before, something that looked like the physical act of deciding to stop being ashamed of a true thing. Royce Decker turned in his chair and watched the room stand up around him. His face had changed. The smoothness had not left it exactly, but something underneath the smoothness had shifted the way a wall shifts before the crack shows. Wren looked at him and said quietly enough that only the front of the room would hear, "You can buy the lot, Mr. Decker. You have the money and I don't. But you can't buy what made it matter. That part was never for sale." The chairman called a recess. In the hallway, the noise of the room behind them was a low, continuous sound that had the energy of people who have done something they were not sure they were going to do and are still feeling the shape of it. Wren stood near the window at the end of the corridor and watched people she had never met shake hands with each other in the way of people discovering a shared history they had carried separately for a long time. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps, but the quality of the space around him, the particular quiet that follows a man who is used to having room clear when he moves through it. But the quality of that quiet was different now. Something in it had changed. Decker came to stand a few feet away and looked out the window beside her. He had the look of a man running a calculation which Wren recognized, because it was the look he had worn since the first day on her porch steps. But the numbers had changed, and she could see from his face that he was aware of that. "Who else knows about that ledger?" he said. His voice was even and careful. Wren did not answer the question he had asked. She reached into her jacket and took out the folded page and held it. "There's something in the ledger that belongs to you," she said. "Not to the case, not to the hearing, just to you." She held it out. "I almost didn't give it to you. I want you to know that. I thought about it for 2 days." He looked at the page in her hand with the wariness of a man who had been handed bad paper before. She kept it steady. He took it, unfolded it with careful hands, read it once quickly the way you read something when you are trying to find the thread in it. Then read it again slowly, and this time the calculation left his face entirely, and something else came in behind it, something that did not have the polished quality of anything she had seen from him before. "Where did you get this?" he said. "She wrote it," Wren said. "Odessa. She kept a record of everyone who ever came through and where they went and what became of them. Your mother came in January of 1963. She was 17 and she had nowhere to go, and someone sent her to the house on Quarry Street because that's where you sent the ones with nowhere to go. She had a baby in the back bedroom in the spring. Then her people came for her and she went back to her life, and she never talked about that year." She looked at him. "But Odessa wrote it down. She wrote it in case the day ever came that somebody needed to give it back to you." Decker did not say anything for a long moment. He was reading the page a third time slowly, the page that was not long and did not need to be long because the facts it contained were the kind that did not require elaboration. "She had a year," he said finally, and his voice had changed, entirely gone to something rougher and less managed than anything she had heard from him. "My whole life there was a year she wouldn't talk about, before she met my father. If you asked her about that time, she'd find a reason to leave the room." He stopped. "I thought it was something she was ashamed of, something that had happened to her." "Something did happen to her," Wren said. "Someone took her in." He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth for a moment. "I built things," he said. "The East Side, the clinic, the housing." He said it the way you say something you are hearing differently than you have ever heard it before. "I thought I was building towards something, making up for whatever it was she couldn't talk about, making a name that was worth having, a name that didn't have a hole in the middle of it." He looked down at the page. "She was a kid," Wren said. "She was alone and she was frightened and somebody took her in the house you came here to tear down." He was quiet again, and this time the quiet was the kind that fills a space rather than leaving it empty. He folded the page carefully along its original crease, the slow, respectful fold of a man handling something he understands he will keep for the rest of his life. "You could have used this," he said. "An hour ago I was trying to take your house out from under you." "I know," Wren said, "but it isn't mine. It never was." She had been carrying it toward you since 1963, and she just needed someone to make the last part of the trip. He looked at her, and there was something in it that she had not seen on his face before, which was the look of a man who does not know what category to put a thing in, because none of the categories he has spent his life building and using are the right shape for it. He was still holding the folded page when the chairman called them back in. Wren went back to her seat and did not look at Decker when he came in behind her. She heard him sit down. She heard the chairman bring the room back to order. She heard the inspector confirm that his recommendation remained as stated. Then Decker asked to speak before the vote. The chairman looked at him with the expression of a man who was not certain what was about to happen in his proceeding. Decker stood. He did not look like the man who had opened the hearing. Something had been reorganized behind his face quietly and without announcement. And the result was a man who was taking up slightly less of the room than he had before. Not through diminishment, but through a different kind of presence. The presence of someone who has set something heavy down and is standing differently for having done it. "I'm withdrawing my company's interest in the property," he said. He said it simply without the warm, persuasive architecture of his earlier remarks. "My firm will not be pursuing acquisition of this parcel." The attorney beside him went very still. "Furthermore," Decker said, "I'd like to request that the commission grant the current owner a reasonable timeline to bring the property to code." He looked at the inspector. "A year. What she's already done in 3 weeks is documented and it's real work. Give her a year." He paused. "I'll cover the outstanding back taxes personally," he said. "Not as a purchase, not as an investment, as a debt I didn't know I owed until this morning." He sat down. The room was quiet in the specific way of a room that has just watched someone do something it did not anticipate and is still working out what it means. The inspector looked at his paperwork, then at Wren's photographs, which the chairman had passed along the table during the recess. He looked at them for a moment with the attention of a man reading something that changes the character of what he has already read. Given the documented repairs and the withdrawal of the acquisition interest, he said, "I'm prepared to revise my recommendation to a conditional compliance timeline rather than immediate demolition." The vote was not close. The room had stood up in there and the commission had seen it stand, and nobody at that table wanted to be the person who called a vote against a house the entire room had just claimed as something that mattered. The back taxes came to $4,230. 12 years of a house nobody had wanted. Decker paid them the following morning at the county clerk's window in person without sending the attorney. He did not ask for his name on any document. The clerk, the same young man with the careful tie who had handed Wren the key 3 weeks before, processed the payment with the careful neutrality of someone who understood he was watching something he would describe differently depending on who asked. Wren was on her porch when Decker's truck came up Quarry Street that evening. Not the large, clean one he had driven the first time. An older truck, dark green with primer on the rear panel and dried mud on the running boards. He came up the walk alone and stopped at the bottom of the steps, and for a moment she had a clear memory of the first time he had stood there with the wool coat and the practiced ease of it. And the distance between that man and this one was not measurable in the usual ways. He was in old clothes, work clothes, the kind that had actually seen work. "Can I see it?" he said. The room. She let him in. She took him up the stairs with a lantern the same way she had taken Dorothea, and he stood in the doorway of the turret room and looked at the shelves of boxes in the child's bed and the desk beneath the window where the town below showed through the cleared glass in its small lit grid. She showed him his mother's box. There was not much in it. A tortoiseshell hair comb, a hospital bracelet, white plastic too small to belong to anyone but a newborn. A folded slip of paper with a weight and a length and a date in the spring of 1963, written in Odessa's hand. 7 pounds 4 ounces, 20 inches. The kind of record a person keeps when they understand that every beginning deserves a witness, even the ones nobody else is watching. Decker sat down on the floor of the room with the box in his lap. not in a chair. On the floor among the 60 years of saved things, with his back against the shelving and the lantern light uneven across his face. He took the items out one at a time and held each one for a moment before setting it down. Wren left him there. Some rooms a person needs to be in alone, and she had learned enough about that particular kind of solitude to recognize it and give it its space. She went downstairs and sat by the cold fireplace, with soot heavy across her feet, and through the floorboards overhead, she could hear very faintly the sound of a man who had built half a city sitting in the dark with the weight of a year his mother had carried to her grave. She did not feel like she had won anything. She was not certain what she felt, which was something quieter and more complicated than winning something closer to the feeling after a long repair, when you stand back and the thing is whole, and you are also tired in a way that goes past the tiredness of the work itself. The tired of having held something carefully for a long time and finally been able to set it down in the right hands. He came downstairs after a long while. His eyes were red and he did not bother to pretend otherwise. He sat down in the one chair in the front room and looked around at the cold fireplace and the lantern and the cat and the water stain on the parlor ceiling she had not gotten to yet. "Tell me what you want it to be," he said. "Not what it was. What you want to build here." The answer came easily, which surprised her, because she had not known until she heard herself say it that she had already decided. "A place for the ones who age out with nowhere," she said. "Kids who turn 18 and get handed a trash bag and a bus schedule and a list of shelters with too few beds. There's nothing in this county for them. I know because 3 weeks ago I was one." She looked at him. Odessa did this for 60 years and nobody helped her, and she did it anyway. "I want to do it differently. I want to do it with the lights on." She looked around the ruined room. "I want to keep the door open," she said. "That's the only rule I'm sure of. Whatever else this place becomes, the door stays open." Decker nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has spent his life reading blueprints and has just been handed one he can finally make sense of. "Then that's what we'll build," he said. But it was Lena who made it real. She came up the hill 3 days later with a folder under her arm and a look that meant she had been doing things while other people were having feelings, which was Lena's particular gift, and had been since before Wren knew her. "You can't run a house full of kids out of your back pocket at 18, she said, sitting down at the kitchen table and opening the folder. "Not legal, not safe, not something that holds up past the first hard winter. So here's what we do." She laid the papers out one at a time. "A charitable organization, a board of directors with adults who answer for it legally and financially. Insurance, state licensing for residential youth services, a real budget with real oversight, and people whose names are attached to it." She tapped the folder. "You run it. You are the reason it exists, and you are the one who keeps the door open. But you don't carry it alone." Her voice changed slightly on the last of it. "That was the one mistake Odessa made," she said. "She carried this house by herself for 60 years, and this town let her. She did it in secret because she had no choice, and she died with the window painted black and the room sealed up because she could not trust the town to hold what she had built." She paused. "We are not going to do that to you." Dorothea took the legal end. She had spent 40 years navigating hospital administration and knew her way through forms and licensing offices and the specific conversations that needed to happen with the right people. And she had the kind of quiet authority that came from being the person in the room who had always done the reading. Decker put up the starting money and his name on none of it. He said he would cover the structural restoration, the electrical, the plumbing, the roof work that went beyond what Wren had patched in the first week. And he said it the way a man says something he has already decided without negotiation or condition. The only thing he asked was that the back bedroom remain a bedroom. Wren signed the line as the one who would keep the door open. The work began in earnest when the first frost broke in March. Decker's crew came on weekdays, professionals with the right licenses and the right tools, moving through the structural and mechanical work with the efficiency of people who have been told to do something correctly rather than cheaply. New wiring ran through the old walls. The plumbing came up entirely to code copper throughout wrapped and insulated. The roof got new decking and new shingles, the bad section Wren had tarped over in her first week properly remedied at last. But on weekends, something else happened. The railroad man came back on a Saturday morning with a truck full of cut limestone and a son-in-law who knew how to use it, and they rebuilt the front steps from the foundation, upfitting the blocks with the unhurried precision of men who learned masonry in a different era and had not forgotten a word of it. He worked 8 hours and drank 3 cups of coffee from the thermos Wren kept refilling, and when he was done, the steps were the best thing about the front of the house. A retired electrician named Garrison showed up the following Saturday and ran new circuits to the outbuilding. Refused payment, refused gas, money, refused everything except coffee, and the company of a person who did not ask him to explain why he was there. He had been one of Odessa's in 1968, a fact he mentioned once and did not elaborate on, and his presence every Saturday for 2 months was the elaboration. Lena brought things up from the salvage yard in her truck across 6 weeks, and the prices on the receipts were not prices. They were the shape of a debt she was repaying to someone who was no longer alive to receive it directly. Period doors, a clawfoot tub, a farmhouse sink with a single cosmetic crack, wide pine flooring for the sections that had gone past saving. Wren did the finish work herself. Every door hung and fitted and planed to its frame. Every window sash eased and glazed where the old glass had cracked. Every stair tread planed flat and finished with 3 coats applied in the direction of the grain. She worked through March and into April with Hollis's tools, and the house came back under her hands the way that wrecked little side table had come back when she was 12, grain by grain, coat by coat. The damage retreating not because it was hidden, but because it was addressed, which is the only honest way to address damage. In February, the new pipes froze a second time briefly during a cold snap that came down faster than the forecast had suggested. The same section she had repaired the night before the hearing, the copper that had already proven it had opinions about hard winters. Wren was in the cellar before dawn looking at it, and this time she was not alone for more than 20 minutes before Garrison was at the door and the railroad man was behind him. And they had the section thawed and wrapped and holding before the sun was fully up. Someone had brought donuts. She did not know who, and it did not matter. That was the difference she understood. Not the work itself, which was the same work Odessa had done for decades. But Odessa had done it in secret alone in a room with a painted window because exposure meant the end of everything. Wren got to do it with the window clear and the door open and people who came when the pipes froze. The turret window got new glass in April, clear and true, and every night from that point forward, Wren left the lamp burning in it. It was visible from the bottom of Quarry Street and from most of the downtown blocks if you looked up toward the hill, which people were starting to do again, having relearned the direction. Spring came slow that year, and then all at once in the first week of May, and Lena had spent the whole winter tracking names. She had worked from the ledger entries Wren had shared with her cross-referencing against what she knew of the town's history and what she could find through the people she had already called pulling threads across 40 years and a dozen states. She wrote letters. She made phone calls to numbers that led to other numbers. She found some of them quickly, some through chains of connection that required patience she did not always have, but applied anyway, and some she could not find at all, which she noted in her own list without allowing it to slow her down on the ones she could. Not all of them were living. Not all who were living could travel. But more than 30 of them came back to the house on Quarry Street on a Sunday in May, and the number of them, the fact of them, was something Wren stood in the front yard and looked at for a long moment before going inside. They came through the broken gate in ones and twos, in small family groups, gray-haired most of them, some with their own grown children beside them, and they moved through the restored rooms with their hands touching the walls and the door frames and the repaired stair rail, the way you move through a place you have carried inside you for a long time and are now confirming from the outside. Wren had taken the boxes down from the shelves in the turret room and arranged them on the long kitchen table sorted by decade as best she could. She had not opened any of them since the first night. They were not hers to open. She stood back and let people find their own. A man in his 60s found his box from 1968 and stood at the table reading the entry she had bookmarked beside it, reading it twice, and then he turned to his daughter who had come with him. A woman in her 30s with the look of someone encountering a piece of her father's life. She had not known existed, and he read the entry out loud to her in a voice that held together until the last line, and then did not. Two women who had been in the house the same winter in 1974 and had not seen each other since, found each other across the crowded kitchen and held on for a long time without speaking the way people hold on when words are not the right instrument for the size of what they are feeling. A man read his own entry out loud to his three grandchildren. The line where Odessa had written came in angry left kind, and he could not finish it. His oldest grandchild, a teenager with the careful composure of someone who did not yet know how to be publicly moved, read the last words for him in a steady voice. A woman found the box of a brother who had died young, too young to come back for himself. She carried it out to her car with both hands, the careful carry of something irreplaceable. They ate in the kitchen, the big kitchen built for crowds, and feeding one again for the first time in 12 years. The table was too small for all of them, so they stood along the walls and sat on the repaired steps, and the room was full of the sound of people finding out they share a history they had carried alone and are still a little surprised by it. Decker came late and came alone. He stood at the edge of the kitchen for a while without joining the group, watching the room with an expression Wren would not have been able to name. After a while, he moved to the center, and the room quieted around him. "I want to tell you something," he said. He did not have the polished delivery of the hearing. He sounded like a man who had practiced this and decided the practice version was not the right one and was saying the real one without preparation. "My mother had a year she never talked about. Her whole life. A year before she met my father, before she built the life we had. She wouldn't name it. If you asked her about that time, she would find a reason to leave the room." He paused. "I spent 50 years ashamed of something I was never allowed to know. I filled that shame with work. I built things because building things felt like a way to make a name that was worth having, a name that didn't have a gap in the middle of it." He looked around the room. "A week ago, I found out what that year was. She came here. She was 17 and she was alone and she was frightened. And she came to this house and someone took her in and kept her until she was ready to go on." He stopped and then started again. "I've been trying to tear this house down," he said, "for 3 years. I'm telling you that plainly. I thought it was just a piece of land I needed. I understand now what I was actually trying to do, and I am done with it." He looked at Wren. "She could have used what she found to stop me. She gave it to me instead. She said it was mine, that it had always been mine." He looked back at the room. "I'm done being ashamed of a year that was the kindest year of a frightened girl's life. My mother deserved better than a son who was ashamed of how she survived. So did the woman who helped her survive it." The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone started to clap, and others followed, not the performance applause of an audience, but the quieter sound of people affirming something they had also been waiting to say out loud. Nobody renamed the house. Someone suggested a plaque, a brass plate with Odessa's name and the years, and Wren said no without being unkind about it. The house was the Vane House. It had always been the Vane House, and it would stay the Vane House. The woman it was named for had spent 60 years making sure her name was not attached to anything, and she was not going to acquire a plaque now that she was gone and could not object to it. The only thing that changed was the window. It stayed lit. October came, and with it the low-angled light of that time of year that made the old sections of the house look warm and permanent against the gray hill. Wren had been here a year. She knew the house now the way you know a thing you have worked with your hands, from the inside, from the places where it had been broken, in the places where the break had been repaired, in the places where the original material was so good it had needed nothing at all. Lena brought Micah up the hill on a Tuesday evening in the third week of October. He was 16 and built along the lines of someone who had been growing fast without enough to eat all sharp angles and watchful stillness. He had a garbage bag of belongings over his shoulder, and he carried it with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that you look less like a target if you make it appear that carrying everything you own is a choice you made rather than a fact you live with. He had been sleeping behind the laundromat on Clement Street for 3 weeks. Someone had told Lena. Lena had told him there was a place up the hill. He stood at the broken gate which Wren had left broken on purpose, because every one of them stood at that gate first and looked up at the house with the evaluating look of someone who had learned to read environments quickly because quick reading was a survival skill. This the haunted house, he said. It was not quite a question. That's what they used to call it, Wren said. She came down the walk to him. My name's Wren. The cat on the porch rail is Soot. He's mean to mice and decent enough to people who don't make sudden movements. Micah looked at the cat without changing his expression. What's the deal, he said. Nobody just has a place. Somebody did, Wren said. She lived here 60 years and kept the door open for people who needed a place to land. She's been gone 12 years. I'm keeping it open now. He looked at her with the flat assessment of someone who had been told comforting things before and had learned to price them accurately. What do you want from me? She made herself look at him the same way Hollis had looked at the wrecked side table on the garage floor, seeing past the surface to the material underneath. I want you to make your own bed in the morning and do your dishes at night and show up to school whether you feel like it or not. That's all. She held his gaze. You'll spend a while waiting for there to be a catch. There isn't one. That's just the part you have to stay long enough to believe. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he came through the gate. She put him in the back bedroom, the room where the roof had once let in a coin of sky, the room where Royce Decker had drawn his first breath in the spring of 1963, and where Dorothea had stayed in 1966, and where how many others between and before the room that had been a place of beginning for more lives than the house had ever advertised. It was warm now and painted the soft color Dorothea had named from memory. And the bed was made up with corners that were sharp because someone had cared about the corners. She gave him sheets and a towel and left him alone because she remembered that the first night somewhere safe, you mostly needed to be left alone long enough to believe it was real. She heard him moving around up there long after the house went quiet, the restless pacing of a person who has learned that safety is a trick played on you in the interval before something worse. She knew that pacing from the inside from every first night in every placement, the body unable to stop watching for the thing that was going to turn out to be wrong. She did not go up. Some things you cannot be told. You have to wake up in the same place enough mornings in a row to learn it in your body rather than your head. And there is no way to accelerate that. And the kindest thing you can do for someone going through it is leave the light on and be there in the morning. Around midnight, the pacing stopped. When she checked in the early hours, his door was open a crack, and Soot had let himself in and stretched out across the foot of the bed. And Micah was asleep with one hand resting in the cat's fur, his face younger in sleep than it had been awake. The same as she had slept that first cold night on the parlor floor. Soot had always known which ones needed him most. In the morning, she found Micah on the second floor landing, looking at the door frame in the back hallway, the one scored from floor to ceiling with pencil marks going back 7 decades. He ran his thumb along one of the lines and looked at the name beside it, and the date 1968, a name she did not know. Who are all these people, he said. Everybody who ever lived here, Wren said. Going back about 70 years, kids mostly. She came to stand beside him. Each line is one person. Each name is someone who stood in the same doorway. He moved along the frame slowly, reading what was legible, passing over what had faded. He stopped near the middle where several marks clustered close together from the same winter, studying them with the focused attention of someone looking for a pattern. Where's yours, he said. She had measured 100 other people's marks against that frame. She had stood at it and read it and thought about it across a whole year and never once turned her back to it herself. She went to the kitchen and got the pencil from the windowsill, the one that lived there for exactly this purpose, and she came back and handed it to Micah. She turned and put her back to the frame. Go ahead, she said. He was careful about it, holding the pencil level, making the mark deliberate. He wrote the date in his own handwriting beside it in the hand of the person who had drawn the line, which meant it was also in the hand of the person who had witnessed it. She turned around and looked at her mark on the frame, and then at all the ones above and below it. 70 years of people who had stood in this exact doorway, and she understood for the first time that she was not the keeper of the frame. She was part of it. She had been part of it from the day she raised her hand in that county annex and paid $15 for a haunted house with a broken gate and a cat in the window and a sealed room full of a dead woman's careful love. And the frame had been waiting for her to understand that. Micah looked at her line for a moment, then at all the others. Something in his shoulders came down almost imperceptibly, less than an inch. The physical release of a posture held too long by someone who has been waiting for the room to get harder, and it has not gotten harder, and the body is beginning slowly and against its own long experience to consider the possibility that it might not. He was a long way still from trusting it. She had been too. She had not trusted it for months, and then one morning she had woken up and realized she had stopped waiting for the catch sometime before without noticing the moment it stopped. She did not tell him this. It was not the kind of information that transferred from one person to another. It was the kind you had to accumulate yourself morning by morning until one day you noticed it had happened. That evening, she walked the house before bed, the way she had taken to doing, checking the doors and the stove and the windows. Soot trailing her down the dark hallway the way he had trailed Odessa before her. Or so she imagined, through the same rooms in the same dark, the same house holding the same quiet purpose under its old rafters. She climbed to the turret room last. She stood at the window where Odessa had sat for years with the paint on the glass and looked out at the town below. The same town that had crossed the street from this hill for decades. A few of its windows were lit at this hour. She wondered, as she had wondered before, how many of the people behind those lights had a thread running back up to this house, a thread they had never followed or had followed only in secret or had carried the whole weight of alone, without knowing there was a room full of people who had carried the same thread and called it the same thing. She trimmed the lantern and left it burning. The light went out across the rooftops and the October trees in the Quarry Street Hill, where the broken gate stood open, the way she had decided it would always stand, the way it had stood for 60 years before her, for the ones who came up the hill in the dark with nowhere to go, and a story they had not yet been given the chance to tell. Home isn't the place that keeps you. She had not known she believed this until she had heard herself say it to a boy with a garbage bag and a question in his eyes, and she had heard it the way you hear a true thing, with the particular resonance of something that has been waiting to be said in the right room at the right time by the right person. It's the place you decide to keep. She left the lamp burning and went to bed in her house on the hill, and the light held through the night the way it does when someone has made up their mind to keep it there steady and visible from below. A thing the town had learned again to look up at, which was all it had ever needed to be.